Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on February 16th, 2017, and you're listening to episode 20. Politicoast is the podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. We made it to episode 20. Our first segment today, Hot Air from the Big Chair. On Tuesday, for Valentine's Day, we got a special treat as Lieutenant Governor Judith Guichon delivered the last throne speech that we're going to get before May's election. This could be Christy Clark's last speech from the throne. We said last week that this would probably be what Clark used to set out her party's election campaign. But as I watched it, because I felt like sitting through a throne speech, instead of getting a bunch of promises like you usually get, things that are going to come up, all I really heard was what they've done over the last couple of years. It was a nice review from sort of her side of the aisle and seeing what they think they've done. But I was left wondering, are the Liberals just out of ideas?
Yeah, and that's what kind of struck me the most too about this whole thing, is just how little there really was in there in terms of bold new priorities or, what they're going to be leading off with going into the next election. Those no big policy announcements or anything. They hinted at a tax cut, but I think everyone pretty much expected that was going to be coming one way or the other. And with a bit of a surplus, they can afford to cut a little bit, and that's unsurprisingly what they led with. But other than that, there's not a huge amount in there. It was a lot of resting on their laurels and kind of hitting the projects that were already on the go. The Massey Tunnel replacement, all that sort of stuff that has been in the works for a while, but it's going to be carrying on through the election.
It was a good retrospective of the sort of handouts that have come over the last year or two. Like you said, there was the Massey Tunnel announcement. There was also a reflection on the sort of failure to live up to the LNG promises that Christy Clark made in the last election. She talked about unforeseen headwinds sort of slowing them down. But she did double down that we're on the cusp of getting more LNG going. This time, it'll work out. And maybe it will. Projects take a long time to get going. But it was a very unambitious platform, or unambitious throne speech.
But that goes with Christy Clark's whole unambitious tenure as premier of the province. She's basically played it safe since taking over from Gordon Campbell. No real new policy announcements or significant changes in direction, and more or less just staying the course until public opinion gets so bad she has to address some problem like the housing thing, and then it's a quick reaction to it, throw a 15% tax on it. But there's pretty consistently been a lack of kind of a long-term plan to build off of and introduce new ideas and go in a new direction.
Yeah, there was talk of a prosperity fund and talk of giving some of this surplus back that they're going to have. And it wasn't actually clear if that's going to come in tax cuts or literal rebate checks, maybe Clark bucks, as it were. And those I'm familiar with from Ralph Klein's days when he sort of ran out of ideas and decided to just throw money back at the people, going, well, we cut our debt, so let's just give people money. It's good to see that the Prosperity Fund has money in it. People are wondering where that money came from because it was supposed to come off of LNG windfalls, as far as I remember. But there haven't been any LNG projects to really put into that, so maybe there's just an accounting thing I missed there. I don't agree with the Clark government on a lot of things, but I do want to see an idea, what's the big vision for this province, and it was keep it in cruise control. One thing that was in there as well was a lot of talk about the sort of risky climate we're in, and that's the sort of justification maybe for keeping it in cruise control with the uncertainty around trade going to the US. We have to ask, what is BC going to do to stave that off? And Christy Clark's sort of plan, particularly around softwood lumber, and the one big announcement that was in there was that she's going to appoint an envoy to Washington to negotiate a softwood lumber trade deal. And it's come out that envoy is going to be David Emerson, the former member of parliament, who I like to think can close deals, because when he was elected as a Liberal in 2006, he managed to make a pretty sweet deal to go straight from being a Liberal MP to a Conservative cabinet member in a matter of days, much to probably the surprise of his own constituents. So maybe he can negotiate something equally shocking for us while he's in Washington. Maybe he'll join the Trump cabinet while he's down there.
So as a kind of hint at what the platform's going to be for the upcoming election, there just really isn't much there. And it's mostly just hitting on everything we've seen so far. So overall, I'd say this wasn't a particularly successful throne speech in terms of how you lay it out going into an election. And maybe when we find out what the give the money back to BC means, that might be a little thing there. But unless they're planning on cutting MSP premiums, I can't see it really gaining much. We already have one of the lowest tax rates in the country. So there isn't a huge amount to gain on that front. So that's all there really is left to do in terms of the give money back, is either hand out a check directly or, cut the very unpopular MSP.
I feel like if they were going to cut the MSP, that's something you could announce there and get a lot of big press and a lot of good attention for. The government has a lot of advantage with the throne speech because the opposition doesn't really get to stand up after and criticize it. They have, a media scrum after, but there's no question period right away to sort of hammer them on it. And so this is uninterrupted 20-30 minutes of just government propaganda, essentially, to lay out whatever they want. And they didn't touch MSP. They missed the chance. So I could be wrong, and we can see in the budget next week whether that's coming down. But MSP cut brings in a lot of money. And so if they're going to take that away, they need to find something to pay for healthcare.
Yeah, it's $2.6 billion it takes in, which would be a couple points on PST to offset that. But they're running a surplus, and while they probably can't entirely eliminate MSP with it, they could at least cut it significantly. Maybe we'll try and see them outflank the NDP on this closer to the election, but that's about all I could really see that really gets pretty popular in terms of the giving money back. And in terms of the other issues, there just wasn't anything new, and that's not always a good sign this close to an election. But we'll have to see with the budget, because that's kind of the other document that's used to lay out what the election platform is going to be by the government.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting next week. It's definitely at the point where Christy Clark's really going to bank on the goodwill and assume that enough British Columbians are content. And maybe that's a safe bet. BC's still doing better than most provinces across Canada. We've weathered much better across different recessions, where Alberta at times has felt like the sky is falling. And whether you blame that on just low oil prices or the NDP, they have a boogeyman there. BC is a bit safer. It's a bit more insulated. We've done well. We have a fairly diversified economy that can weather these kind of storms. So Christy Clark can run on that record and say, look, things aren't too bad. Why would you take a risk? So I won't be surprised if we see another sort of risky NDP campaign coming forward where it's, you may not love me, but things haven't been bad and you don't know what you're going to get. They're going to tax you and waste all your money. And it'll be sort of stereotypical fear the NDP. And so I guess the challenge for the NDP will be to hold the mirror up to the Christy Clark record and say where they feel it falls down. I think we saw that already in their first approach on question period, where they really hammered on this Alex Gervais story we talked about last week, which was the young man in care who committed suicide. And the NDP was pointing out that the government didn't bring up childcare or how it's sort of failing foster care in this province in its throne speech. And it was interesting because the NDP here brought in what we've seen at the federal level a lot, which is party discipline to the point where multiple members are bringing the same question in to really hammer an issue. Whereas in the past, it was a lot more, each member had their sort of own personal question to take on. So maybe on that way, they can start to chip away and build the case that the record isn't as good as Christy Clark's pretending. But the other thing the NDP will have to do is build some kind of alternate narrative, because it's not just enough to say what the Liberals have done wasn't great, if that's what you believe. In the last couple of elections, the NDP's had this problem of not putting forward the vision that people really get. Thomas Mulcair talked about balancing budgets, and people went, well, okay, we want something better. Adrian Dix sort of flip-flopped on a couple issues and didn't really cement a bold, clear platform. I think Horgan's starting to build it. His climate plan was much more well received than I think we expected. And so even if they're modest steps, he can potentially make that kind of vision for the future, vision for BC.
It's the thing to watch from this upcoming election, because typically for a party that's been in power so long, they've accumulated enough scandals that they're unpopular enough that it's the opposition's party's election to lose. But we haven't really seen that. The polls have been kind of split evenly on there, and I don't think a huge amount of people really know who John Horgan is, which maybe that'll change once the election kicks off, but it's not a good place to start from. And it's going to be interesting to see how the NDP plays it, because they're in more of an uphill slog than they ought to be based on just how tired and how many accumulated scandals there are for the Liberal Party. But they haven't really been able to make anything stick either. And there's a couple opportunities for them. I mean, the high cost of housing is going to be a big one, but so far they haven't really been able to latch onto it and really make the governing party hurt from the problems that are there. And it's going to be interesting to see how John Horgan manages the campaign. Moving on to segment 2, Islamophobia. Federal politics this week has been kind of dominated by an oddly contentious motion in the House of Commons, M103. This was put forward by Liberal MP Itra Khalid, basically a motion that condemns Islamophobia and encourages the government to take steps to address the problem. And somehow this has been oddly contentious, despite the shooting a couple weeks back in a mosque and the fact that similar motions have been put forward for plenty of other groups in the past without them erupting into this mess. A huge swath of the Conservative leadership candidates have come out against it. 13 of the 14 have all opposed it to one degree or another. Michael Chong being the only one who's actually said he's going to back the motion. And other Conservative MPs have had some issues with language and whatnot, but are generally a little more supportive. But it's a motion, which is a non-binding, basically, statement of support by Parliament. It's the parliamentary equivalent of a bumper sticker, and it's mostly a symbolic gesture that's really of no consequences in terms of the law or anything else. And it's just odd that it's taken up so much energy and just kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room in terms of other stuff this week. Yeah,
I know in a lot of the circles in the sort of atheist movement that I've been involved in, the word Islamophobia is kind of a trigger for a lot of people. And I use that word trigger very deliberately there. There's some legitimate concern about the word because there are extremist Islamists who have tried to basically say any criticism of Islam is Islamophobic, and even saying that there's misogyny in Saudi Arabia is Islamophobic. And that's absurd. And that's not what anyone here is talking about. When Ms. Khalid introduced her motion, she defined Islamophobia as the most commonly used definition, the one she ascribes to, being the irrational hatred of Muslims that leads to discrimination. For example, let's say the shooting of 6 people who were praying peacefully. And so there's this idea that I think comes from the sort of alt-right that Islamophobia is being brought in by these, Islamist Muslims to try to push Sharia law. And so this motion is really a backdoor to start to bring in a law down the road, which will then bring in a blasphemy law in Canada and penalize any criticism of Islam. And so they focus on things like this term's not defined in the motion. And they focus on things like this only singles out one religion despite being a motion against religious discrimination. But the motion itself condemns Islamophobia, quote, and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination. And it calls on the government to study the issue. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we need to actually start studying hate crimes in this country a lot more, because we've spent a lot of time looking actually at Islamic extremism, both in Canada and abroad, and our security agents have been very aware of this. But we also know they haven't been focused as much on right-wing extremism, which has grown to the point where you have shootings in mosques and you have a growing number of hate crimes and swastikas and things being thrown around the country almost freely.
Yeah, all of those criticisms I would be fine if this was a actual bill being put forward and was potentially going to become law. And then, yeah, there's legitimate concerns about why the law would be singling out a single, or why the term is so ill-defined in the law. All of those are completely valid concerns if this was a bill, but it's not. And that's what makes the whole thing kind of weird, is you don't need those sorts of precise definitions for a general motion. And because of that, it's got completely blown out of proportion. You have the rebel organizing rallies against it, with 4 of the leadership candidates, Tross, Leach, Alexander, and Lemieux, all showing up to denounce it. And overall, it just creates a more contentious state of affairs in the public discourse than is needed at all. And, well, free speech concerns are definitely a real thing and should be taken seriously. This is not the place to fight them, because this doesn't actually do anything about that. And it's just odd to see people who allegedly care about this stuff wasting so much political capital on a virtue signaling exercise like this.
Today we literally saw the Conservatives bring in their own motion that was almost word for word identical, but instead of talking about Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, they instead condemn all forms of systemic racism, religious intolerance, and discrimination of Muslim, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, and other religious communities. And they really positioned it almost in a all discrimination matters kind of way, like, why should we just focus on the black community when everyone is subject to some discrimination? I've seen people online say, why does the word Islamophobia exist when there's just the word bigotry and that catches all things? And it's like, well, we can talk about sexism because there are problems with how women are treated versus how men are treated. And we can talk about racism because people are treated differently depending on the color of their skin. And it's just like, let's obfuscate the issue by getting all high and mighty about it. Meanwhile, mosques are getting shot up.
Yeah, the level of argument going on over just the language of this is just absurd. It's the sort of thing that, any of those motions language would be fine. For a purely symbolic, hey, we don't like discrimination, or don't like discrimination of the Muslim community, or any of the, it would all be completely fine, no matter which one it is. Either one would be fine to pass. They could just, both parties could agree on one of them, vote for it, and the whole thing could go away. But I don't think either party particularly wants to do it. The Liberals have been pretty steadfast in refusing to accept amendments to the motion, and the Conservatives are hammering the point about how vague the language is, and none of them seem to be willing to compromise or just say, hey, it's a motion, this doesn't actually matter all that much, we'll just vote for it. The Liberals, I think, are playing a bit of a wedge game here, where they'd really like to have the Conservatives in the same position they were in 2015 with the whole niqab thing, where they're kind of off on one side, and the Liberals can play their pretty typical, watch out for the Conservatives, they're a bunch of bigots, you need to vote for us because, look at what those guys are going to do. And this plays right into that, and their refusal to kind of compromise on it allows them to maintain that wedge in there. And all the Conservative leadership candidates, save one, seem to be taking the bait on that too. And as far as I can tell, only Michael Chong seems to be thinking beyond May 27th right now. And all of this stuff, the Liberals are going to be taking the, footage from these sorts of things and running attack ads in 2 years' time.
Well, but you're assuming that being a party against bigotry can win again. And that assumption worked really well before last year. Like 2015, that assumption worked. I'm not so confident anymore. Justin Trudeau talked how, you don't want the Kelly Leach party in Parliament. Well, we're getting dangerously close to that. And it's almost getting hyperfueled. I feel like everyone's playing with fire here. And it's only so long before, we burn the House of Commons down by accident or on purpose, depending which side of the aisle you're on. And I don't know who will do it. The Leaches and Lemieux and Tross and even Maxime Bernier, who was initially supportive of this motion, came around to the anti-side because I think he's got a sense of where the wind's blowing within the Conservative Party. And when you just browse hashtag M103 on Twitter, it is a vile place. It is overwhelmingly anti this motion. There is a whipped up, angry crowd of rebel supporters. And maybe they're not a significant majority of this country, but they are wielding their power within the Conservative Party right now. And I think people are missing this. And that's what's really making 13 out of 14 Conservative Party leadership candidates take a side on this. And it might be the case that Michael Chong right now is being called essentially a liberal in blue clothes. And it might be the case that if he doesn't win the Conservative Party leadership, which he probably won't, let's be honest, he crosses the floor or just gives up on his party because his party will have left him. And that's what we saw happen in Alberta with the Progressive Conservatives, who are just progressive in name now, where Jason Kenney has sort of taken it with the rebel crowd into this anti-elite status. The only party really positioned well in here is the NDP, who can realistically vote for both motions and say, yeah, all discrimination is bad. We don't like Islamophobia. We don't like general religious discrimination. Let's just move on. And they can just sort of float above it. But the thing that is concerning me is that this sort of fringe alt-right movement led by Ezra Levant is wielding power and is arguably doing a lot more. Well, and on the other side, you have most of the pundits, Andrew Coyne, David Aiken, most of the people I saw on Twitter who have columns in the National Post or in the Walrus or whatever, were like us. They didn't get why this blew up, or they just saw through the sort of arguments being thrown out by these conservative politicians at this point and said, it's just emotion, get over it. But then you have all of the sort of Twitterati mob who are angry, and it's a divide almost between the alt-right political group and the elite class, as it were.
I think part of this too is that just because it's such a crowded slate right now on the leadership race, everybody's inching for any little bit of leverage they can get, and especially because there isn't particularly reliable polling on Conservative Party members, just because there's only 90,000 some odd in the country, and it's really hard to get any good breakdown where you can actually look at where people are, just because the sample size on any one poll is going to only capture a couple dozen at most. It's really hard to get a good view of that. So I think a lot of it is people are trying to almost go off instinct on what and where kind of the conversation seems to be happening, which gives kind of the louder voices more sway just because they have a loud voice and there's little kind of alternative data to that to kind of point people in a different direction. So we're going to have to see what that means, when the actual ballots are cast, and what this does to the membership drive, which is going on right now. Like all the candidates are really focused on selling memberships, and that's going to also kind of determine where this is. I mean, are people getting scared off from this, or are people going, oh, I don't want those guys in, let's all join up with the party and, vote for someone sane. So it's kind of a little hard to say right now on this, but it's, I think, definitely going to hurt them going forward if one of the people who made a loud statement on this gets the leadership, because this is the sort of thing the Liberals will hang around the neck of the Conservatives and drag them down going forward. And while I do take your point, especially after this past year, that I wouldn't rule anything out, because a lot of the safe assumptions have kind of been shaken in this past year. I still think the groundwork's going to be a little hard for kind of a populist right to really win in a general election, especially with the way the vote splits between the Liberals and NDP. Because, if you have a Kelly Leach, the Liberals will do their standard, you can't let those guys win, all you NDP-leaning voters, you better come over here, because only we can stop them. And in general, I just don't think there are enough Canadians out there to really mobilize that big a base for. And if anything, I think it's going to be more of a moderate centrist who will be able to unseat the Liberals, but we'll just have to see on it. And this is the sort of thing that parties sometimes do, where they, after losing an election, they kind of elect a crappy leader who, sits well with the base until they get tired of losing a couple of elections and go with the most electable guy, which it's starting to seem like that's the pattern they're going to be following this time. Overall, I put this whole debate as a low point for the general political discourse at the national level, and particularly for the Conservative Party race.
Worse than Elbowgate?
Not quite that bad. But similarly, a mountain made out of a molehill of a non-issue.
All right. Well, let's move on to our third segment, the handshake heard around the world.
Yesterday, the president had an incredibly productive set of meetings and discussions with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada.
Earlier this week, Justin Trudeau, or Joe Trudeau as he's known now, went to Washington and met with Donald Trump. It was the long-awaited first meeting of what's been pitched as the autocrat versus the last liberal beacon of the West. And in the end, all that seems to have happened is we spent a lot of time talking about a handshake or two. And fuck. What a waste of time.
And if anything, I think that's the biggest success of the whole thing, is that such a minor thing got so much news attention just because none of the worst case scenarios everybody was very, very concerned about ended up happening. And the fact that it went so smoothly and there was almost so little that was newsworthy about it, you can focus on a handshake, is a good sign that the meeting actually went fairly well. We didn't end up in a shouting match like Malcolm Turnbull did with Donald Trump. And with the president as unpredictable as him, that might be the best victory we can hope for in this.
Yeah, there were a good number of headlines talking about how it definitely plays into the narrative of Canada being the boring country or the nice country that sort of settles everything down. And I just have this little bit of a fear that Trudeau's playing a little bit of the Neville Chamberlain to the Trump of the South. And it's not like we've gone to the full extent of appeasement, and Trump's not declaring parts of Mexico part of his country, and I don't expect that to happen. But there was, I think, a hope, especially on the left, that Trudeau would challenge Trump on especially like the refugee and immigration ban and some of the other actions and say, look, we are a country that accepts immigrants and we're still a very pro-immigration country. And we have a lot of concerns because we have these agreements right now and the policies the US is taking is affecting that. Instead, it seems like immigration didn't even come up. They sort of tiptoed around it. Maybe because it's the first meeting and he just wanted to get off on a nice foot.
I think that's most likely what it is. And I think the Neville Chamberlain thing's maybe a little unfair here, because this is a very important relationship between Canada and the US, and it's not the best long-term strategy to sour that right off the start, because we're probably going to have to put up with this with 4, hopefully not 8 years. Although, considering some of the more recent scandals, Donald Trump might be impeached long before that. The key here is that for a first meeting, especially with a president as unpredictable as this, now is maybe not the time to really kind of hit the points of disagreement. It's we want to build as many bridges as we can and keep the relationship as strong as we can. Well, still going to be working on other stuff. And remember, we have the NAFTA renegotiations probably coming up, and that is going to be a huge challenge that we're going to have to face. And if we don't get that right, it could really hurt Canada's long-term prospects. So I actually think Trudeau's strategy of not directly confronting Trump, but kind of just continually saying, yeah, this is how we do it in Canada, is probably the best approach, at least for now, because it means we don't piss off someone who's a little erratic and prone to outbursts, but at the same time, we make it clear where we stand and that we're not on board with this, and especially on the immigration thing, that's probably going to be ruled unconstitutional when it hits the courts. Maybe this isn't the best time to wade into it.
Well, on the meat of the issue, as you bring up NAFTA, that is one place where it seems like Trudeau did score a victory. I had to dig for it, but I did find that Trump sort of committed that there'll be minor tweaks to the Canada side, but his focus is all on Mexico, which there's an argument to be made that Canada should be standing up with Mexico and with other countries, and that if we're going to be a country that supports free trade, and that's a separate argument, but if we're going to be one that supports free trade, we should support it with all our allies rather than just sort of self-interest. Hopefully we don't attract the ire of the beast. I think Canadians underestimate how much latitude we can stand up. Americans don't actually give a shit about us. Chrétien was able to stand up to Bush and say, no, we're not going to Iraq and throwing Canadian soldiers' lives away for poor evidence at best, which turned out to be not much of weapons of mass destruction. So we could easily stand up to Trump a bit more on some of these issues. And maybe it's a timing issue, but these do affect our own immigration. And the Liberals have sort of followed through on some of the Harper changes that give more power to U.S. security guards to act in Canada. And that starts to really worry civil liberties associations because the Americans don't have the best track record of respecting things like that. So the agreements on NAFTA are probably a good thing. And maybe what was said in the back room versus what was said in the press conference are different things. And the sort of soft diplomacy will bring the U.S. a little more stability, but it's still concerning because I'm not sure that Trudeau is as committed as people think he is to a sort of open liberal state.
Well, I think it's a lot more just about the kind of strategy of it and very much going with the set the example and not necessarily talk a lot about it. And, well, there's definitely some concerns about the border situation, and there's a bill in front of Parliament right now to kind of expand some of that. Overall, I think the better strategy is to kind of just set the example of, this is what a well-functioning liberal democracy looks like. And every time it comes up, just continually hammer the point home that, this is how we do things here. And not directly denouncing, but definitely signaling our significant disagreements on it. Just doing it a little more subtly is probably the best approach. And with the Bush issue, I think Bush was a lot more level-headed and stable on this sort of stuff. And, well, I'm sure he was disappointed we didn't sign on to missile defense or Iraq. There's definitely a recognition there that, it was a valuable relationship and you shouldn't sour it over those disagreements. I wouldn't necessarily say there's the same thought processes going through Trump's head.
I think if Trudeau wants to take a leadership role, there are things, like you're saying, he should be doing, but on a lot of the immigration things and civil liberties things, he's not actually living up to those promises. And like you talk about, set that example of a well-functioning democracy, but this is a government that just reneged on a key election platform to reform our democracy and make it better. This is one who's sort of made a lot of promises, but then not kept them and focused a lot more on image than substance. And so my only hope, I guess, is that if Trump is looking to take lessons from Trudeau, that he's not looking too deeply, because I think the more deep you look, the more cynical you can easily get about Canadian politics.
Yeah, and well, Trudeau's definitely not perfect, and there's definitely been some issues with how he's handled things in the past. I think overall the immigration file has gone fairly well, especially on that front. And that one, I think, is where he's actually really done more to set the bar. The limits have been increased on how many immigrants overall we're accepting. A lot of refugees are coming over as well. So that, I think, is one area where it does really come down to setting the example. Some of the other areas, like the democracy thing, there's definitely problems, and he's done nothing to roll at the overly powerful PMO where, basically everything gets run out of there rather than Parliament. So there's, concerns going forward, but especially in the immigration file, I think it's well done. And the cynic in me is kind of wondering how many people are kind of crunching the numbers on, well, if the, skilled immigrants aren't going to the US, how many of them are going to be coming here, and what's the economic boost of that? But that might just be me being cynical.
It's the age of cynicism, so that's probably a good position to take. Well, let's close off with a few quick takes. First up, Peter Julian, who registered to be an NDP leadership candidate in December, officially launched his bid on Sunday at a smallish campaign event in New Westminster. He had about 100 people there. he didn't make a lot of big pronouncements, but he did talk about wanting to make university tuition free, which is an interesting proposal considering university in Canada is funded at the provincial level. And so there's probably a way to do it, but it's one of those sounds better on paper than would work out in process. And it was also a little bit surprising as Julian's not really known for the more left-wing flank. He's sort of this moderate New Democrat, a reasonable, nice guy from everything I've heard, but has never really jumped out at me as that charismatic, but maybe I'll be surprised.
Yeah, the tuition thing, I think, is one of those areas where the NDP sometimes likes to intrude a little bit too much into provincial jurisdictions. Well, they've never actually run a federal government to do it in practice. A lot of their positions tend to take a high degree of interest in provincial matters. So it seems actually kind of in line with a lot of kind of the more general NDP philosophy on this sort of thing. In terms of raw policy point, I'm not entirely sold it's the best use of resources. And university is definitely a very valuable investment in human capital. At the same time, it's the sort of thing where you have a high upfront cost and a big gain in terms of income and returns on it over the long haul. And that's actually the sort of areas where taking out a little debt isn't necessarily the worst approach to it. As far as debt-financed things go, it's basically one of the best things is those sorts of long-term investments. And I'm wondering if there's better areas to focus on in terms of resources than making it free, maybe reducing costs or focusing elsewhere, maybe underwriting some of the interest costs. There's a bunch of different options here. I'm just not sure making it free is going to be the best thing, especially because as you drop the price of something, you increase demand and it's going to put more strain on the system. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. I'm not entirely sold on the policy, but it seems to me a pretty typical NDP platform to go on, and we'll just have to see what other policy announcements get rolled out in the future.
Yeah, it may be that he's just trying to angle for the younger vote, which when Nikki Ashton jumps into the race, she'll have the strongest lead on because she spent the last 2 years, maybe more, maybe her entire political year, trying to speak to youth issues. She did a large cross-country tour last year, going from city to city, speaking to millennials and trying to raise their voices and say, what are the issues affecting you and how can the federal government help? So she's got that base, and maybe Peter Julian wants all of those second votes to sort of become the consensus candidate. Or maybe he just wants to get some excitement because it's going to be hard. He's got the early lead. We're expecting Charlie Angus, Sid Ryan, a union leader, maybe Guy Caron, a Quebec MP, and most likely Jagmeet Singh, the member of the provincial parliament in Ontario, who's always described as very well dressed, which I'm sure he'll get tired of. But if he enters, he'll be the let's get a flashy Trudeau type, but even more multicultural because it's the NDP candidate. So we'll keep our eye on the NDP leadership race because now there almost is a race.
Yeah, it will be nice to talk about a leadership race that isn't the Conservatives for a change.
And that doesn't have 14 candidates.
Although, we'll have to wait and see on that one. Looking a little further afield, the European Parliament in Strasbourg voted to ratify the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, the free trade deal between Canada and the European Union. That was voted on Wednesday and passed, and it's one of the final steps in what has been a long and arduous process of developing closer trade ties with Europe. We talked about this in the fall when it looked like Wallonia was going to gum up the works here. And this is kind of just a welcome sign that in the age of Trump, free trade isn't dead and that we're continuing to expand our access abroad and diversify the number of economies we do trade with. And that's going to give us a stronger leg up as the U.S. increasingly withdraws into a more protectionist stance.
This should mean good things for most Canadians when you go to shop for things. There should be a wider selection of European cheeses, some better deals on European automobiles and wines and spirits. And I like all of those things, even if I can't always afford them. The one sort of risk that's been touted is it does expand a little bit of the length of patents, and that could have effects on the pharmaceutical industry, essentially raising prescription drug prices. It's hard to know exactly how that will play out. It's one of the big things that I think a lot of activists are very worried about, as well as the more generalized, will this mean a big shift of jobs? Will manufacturing shift to Eastern Europe versus Canada? And it's one of those things that's really hard to predict. Things will move around. There'll be things that come to Canada. Overall, I think it's a good process forward. It's probably not perfect because no agreement ever will be. But now it just faces a final hurdle of being passed in the Canadian Senate. And then I guess it's law.
I wouldn't be too worried about the manufacturing impacts of this. We're fairly similar economies overall. And, well, the German manufacturing sector is really efficient and actually produces a lot. Overall, I don't see this affecting things too much one way or the other. It's much more going to be useful for kind of this high value-added service sector and some of the more agricultural products. The Maritimes will probably actually benefit quite a bit because the European Union is one of their main export destinations. And the other thing that's going to impact this is there's some rules about government procurement, which is going to have effects on provincial procurement policies. And what that means is European companies can have greater access to bid on Canadian domestic procurement, which doesn't always happen between provinces. So I think it's going to add a little more incentive to finally bring Canada into an actual true free trade area domestically 150 years after Confederation.
Next up, Washington State Governor Jay Inslee has set aside $1 million over the next couple years to study the feasibility of a high-speed rail from Vancouver to Seattle to Portland. This is one of those things that's been talked about for a long time and could potentially be very feasible. There is a lot of cross-border traffic and people who go between those cities, and they're close enough that a high-speed rail would actually be useful. You could cut these 2-hour, 3-hour trips down to an hour or two. So it'll be something we're going to keep our eye on for sure. I would love to go to Portland in a couple hours, at least once there's a new administration.
Yeah, this is, as far as I'm concerned, a great idea to, at very least, do a feasibility study on and look seriously at building. High-speed rail tends to be the most economical in about 200 to 1,200 mile range. Shorter than that, driving's usually quicker, easier. Longer than that, airfare actually tends to be cheaper. So it's kind of that sweet spot, and the Vancouver-Portland corridor fits that really well. You know, it's reasonably densely populated. You got 3 big cities and some intermediate places between there. You know, Bellevue, Olympia. So overall, it's actually a fairly good spot to do. And it's one of the few places in North America that actually it made sense to put a high-speed rail in. The other one being the Northeast corridor in the States and arguably the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor. But other than that, most of North America is just a little too spread out to do. And there's a lot of kind of cross-border stuff going on here. The Pacific Northwest is fairly well integrated despite the border. And I think this will only help that integration even more. And, well, the border obviously is a little bit of a hassle, and kind of the stop there is going to slow down the high-speed rail a bit. But overall, I think it's a good plan. Then we just have the cost and the political will to do it, and that's going to be something that's going to be a bit of a challenge. The California high-speed rail that's currently being built, although that's a little bit of a misnomer because it's the slowest high-speed rail system in the world, has been somewhat controversial, and we're going to have to see if that's the same thing here if they ever go forward on it. And hopefully we avoid the same mistakes they did of trying to reuse sections of track versus building new. And that's what actually makes it so slow, is because they have to slow down to normal traffic speed in the cities. But that also means we're going to have to pay a little more. So it's going to be an interesting project if it goes ahead. But overall, I'm fairly optimistic on the benefits of this and the worthwhileness of the project. I'm excited that somebody's deciding to kick in some money for a study on it.
And we'll have to see if any of the BC political parties are willing to put their money on the line as we go into the election. And speaking of, before we close off, we should give a final plug just to remind everyone, at least in British Columbia, to register to vote. The ads have started going up on transit, and if you just go to elections.bc.ca/OVR, you can check or register for the first time to vote for the upcoming election. Do it all online in about 5 or 10 minutes, and make sure you vote.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.